Our text today is from chapter 29 in the first book of Samuel. The Philistine commanders were angry with King Achish and said, "What are these Hebrews doing here? Is not this the David they sing about in their songs, saying, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000? The story of David is the longest continuing story in the Bible. And I had to grow this old before I noticed something I had never seen. In this whole long story, there's not a single miracle. Not one. Nothing at all to compare to the supernatural, like the Red Sea parting for Moses and his people to cross over. Like Elijah atop Mount Carmel calling down fire from heaven to consume the sacrifice and the altar of stone. Or like the Syrian soldier boy Naaman who bathed in the Jordan 7 times to cleanse away his leprosy. In this fascinating story, the chain of events are linked together by natural causes. And you can feel the undercurrent as you can looking back over your life. That God is using the ordinary every day to shield you and guide you and protect you and save you, just as He did David. The family gave David the most demeaning job on the farm, nursemaid to the sheep. He was so far out of sight and out of mind that they did not even invite him to the dinner party in honor of the great prophet Samuel. Later, David's father sends him on an errand to check about the welfare of his 3 brothers who are in the army. And David arrives at the camp at that very moment. The Philistine giant Goliath is defying the armies of Israel, a duel to the death, winner take all. David brought down the Philistine giant that day with a single stone from his sling. And the armies of Israel thoroughly routed the Philistines on the field of battle. But when they came back home, people everywhere lined the roadways with dancing and singing and saying, Saul has slain his thousands, but David is 10,000. Just a simple little ditty. And they meant no harm by that at all. But that little song was to change the course of David's life. Not once, but twice. On hearing that song, King Saul was inflamed with jealousy. Looked at David with an evil eye, trying to put David to death time after time. And finally, David ran away for his own life. But even there, Saul hunted him down, year after year, place after place in the wilderness, and came close many times. Very close. David never planned on spending a decade of his life in the wilderness. And at the end, he and his men had nowhere left to hide. And to complicate matters further, they were joined by their wives and their sweethearts and their families so that they could no longer travel fast and travel light. David's caught between the proverbial stone and a hard place. He cannot raise his hand against Saul, the Lord's anointed. On the other hand, he can't run anymore either. And so David seeks refuge among the Philistines. He tried that once before, and it was a disaster. But this time, King Achish of Gath welcomes him with open arms. For now David is Saul's sworn enemy. And now David is bringing with him a well-disciplined band of soldiers. Achish gives David a border town to live in, an abandoned, burned-out village on the frontier by the name of Ziklag. And it suited David and his men ideally. From Ziklag, they struck out on their own and attacked the ancient enemies of Israel in the south, Amalek and Geshur. David brought back wagon loads of the spoils of war, which he shared with King Achish, who was impressed. Where did you go raiding today? In the south of Judah, David says, which wasn't exactly a lie, but it sure wasn't the truth either. There are no prisoners of war, no survivors, no captives, so nobody to say. Achish thinks David is plundering the villages of Israel. And David lets him keep right on thinking that. It's a dangerous game he's playing, these covert military operations. They're going to get caught sooner or later. But episodes like this remind us, David is not set down in the Bible to be our role model. You always hear that junk. Somebody that we're to imitate. No. In the company of David, we no longer feel inadequate, thinking that we could never have done it that well. The opposite is true. In David's company, we're in the company of somebody who does it as badly as we do, who does things worse than we have ever done. In David, you do not have an ideal life. What you have is a real life. In the company of David, our sense of what it means to be human is deepened. And our senses are sharpened to guilt and pardon, sin and grace, human need and divine deliverance. David never quits on God, never gives up on God. He's always alive to God, aware of God, and responsive to God, no matter what he does. But now war has broken out, and an impossible situation has become worse. The Philistines are massing for an attack at Aphek. They're going to invade the heartland of Israel. You know, don't you? King Achish is saying to David, that you will march to war with me. Naturally, King Achish wants to swell his military ranks with these well-trained mercenaries. And naturally, David knows that the minute he bought sanctuary in with the Philistines, he was also obligated to their military service. You know what we will do, David says. Again, the ambiguous double fork. What we will do, yeah. Do for whom? And against whom? And King Achish takes the obvious meaning. After all, David's loyalty is well proved, and he makes David and his men his royal bodyguard. And so they marched north to Aphek, to the gathering of the Philistine kings and their armies and their allies. And it must have been the longest day's march in David's life, trying to figure out what in the world he's going to do now. David had always fought or run or taunt or schemed his way out of trouble. But not this time. What will he? What can he and his men do on the day of battle? He had cleverly escaped from the wilderness to safety among the Philistines, but now he finds out he's leaped from the frying pan into the fire. And actually, things were worse than David knew. He didn't know anything about the last dark night of Saul's life, about Saul's visit to the witch's cave at Endor, how paralyzed with fear Saul was, how undermanned and demoralized the troops of Israel were, that the battle would not be a battle at all, but a slaughter. The Philistines would thoroughly crush the forces of Israel. And what about his boys, the guys who trusted him implicitly and who had followed him so bravely? They would be caught right in the middle of that carnage. David was brave, and he was strong, and he was clever, and none of it is going to help him now. He can't run, and he can't quit. And I can't tell you how many times in life you and I find ourselves in the same situation. We're just stuck. David has been swept along by events that he did not choose, but he couldn't change them either. Just as you and I in our day, by the political goings-on, our social culture, our job restructurings and relocations. What are we going to do about that? But I want to remind you, this story is the story of God's salvation and not human exploit. Pick up on that, people. We don't have to control everything, know everything, do everything, solve everything as if we could. God is at work in all of these things among which you and I live every day. And He can use anything. Watch what happens here to prove to you that God can use danger, suffering, distress, even death to deliver His own. The Philistine kings are in the reviewing stand, and by the thousands the armies pass by under their regimental colors. And the final contingent that day raised eyebrows. And then raised voices. What are these Hebrews doing here? Is not this the David of whom they sing at their dances? Saul has slain his thousands, and David is 10,000? King Achish might have forgotten what David once did to the Philistine giant Goliath, but those fighting men never forgot. They had faced David too many times on the battlefield, lost too many of their own comrades to ever think that David was going to be an ally of theirs. Send these men elsewhere, I don't care where, but get them out of here. And Achish, he tries to explain, but they don't buy a bit of it. Personally humiliated, publicly embarrassed, King Achish apologizes to David. And again, he gives one of those forked meanings answers and take your men and go home. And so, on the morning of battle, before the camp is astir, David and his guys gather their gear together and begin the long march back to Ziklag in the south. David is rescued, but in a way that only God could have managed. David is rescued by the Philistines. And if you think that's odd, it isn't even the first time the Philistines have unknowingly saved David's life. Years earlier, David and his men got themselves somehow trapped in a blind canyon with no way out. The bloodhounds of Saul nipping at their heels. And at the last second, word reached Saul's camp. The Philistines have attacked the rear. And Saul has to call off the search and protect his back. And ever after, David and his men looked at the high walls of that canyon and called it the cliff of escape. Not only had the Philistines saved David from King Saul, the Philistines have saved David from the Philistines. You can see, can't you, why David would say in a psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd." There was no other accounting for it. But the Lord had done for him what a shepherd does for the sheep, lost and gone astray, defenseless and helpless. He maketh me lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness. And if you can look back in your life and say that, then you may, with all confidence, say the next line. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art ever with me. Amen.